thanks for coming. When I realized that it was going to be such an intimate thing, we decided that we'd forego the big slideshow that we do. I have a new book that came out, and up in the Bay Area, this is quite a popular book, Tamil Pious Walking. So with my friend, the poet Gary Snyder, we've done a few events that have had hundreds of people at them for this book. So tonight, I thought, well, we'll just, you can all hear me without a microphone, you can all see me. I brought my box of goodies here to tell you about my printmaking technique a little bit. And then I also brought a couple of my handmade books, even one that goes way back, the original Tamil Pious book from when I started learning how to make prints and put them together in handmade books back in the 1970s in Santa Cruz. And all the way up through this book that I know I'm never going to do anything as nice as this again. So it's my best handmade book, the High Sierra of California from around the year 2000. And I'll page through those if you'd like to afterwards. I'll put them on the table and you can look through these handmade books. The way I got into printmaking was because I wanted to do a series of images to put in illustrated books that I was going to make by hand. And I got started on the project of doing something about Mount Tamil Pious, this name that means western or coastal mountain in Miwok, the Indian language of the county where I grew up, Marin County, just north of San Francisco. I wanted to make pictures of this mountain that looked like Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji. Since I was a little boy, I was, just enthralled by those, especially Hokusai's, also Hiroshige's landscape prints when I was 10, 12 years old. And by the time I was a teenager, I started making little linoleum cut prints of Mount Tamil Pious. And I never got to 36, I got to 28 by the time I'd finished college. And I studied history in college, I didn't study art. So I really was doing this as something on the side, writing little haiku poems to go with it. And I purposely learned how to print letterpress on a little hand-cranked galley proof press, a hand press, in 1974-75 so that I could print this book. And I found some beautiful handmade Hosho paper, and I printed this book in the summer of 1975 with 28 views of Mount Tamil Pious. And that book was something that sort of took on a life of its own. And one of the places it went is I took it up to visit a friend of mine, was living on some land up in the Sierra Nevada mountains near Nevada City. And this poet that I just adored lived up there. He'd recently moved up there, Gary Snyder, who some of you probably know his work, one of the great still living poets of the beatnik era. He got a little too popular when he was the star of the Dharma Bums, written by Jack Kerouac. They sort of, Kerouac reinvented him as Jaffe writer and gave him sort of a backwoods personality, and everybody in my generation, all the young men, wanted to be just like him. I mean, I even went off and worked in the woods for a couple of days till I realized how hard it was. And so Gary was living up there on this land right next to where one of my high school friends was living, so I went up and my friend introduced me to him, and I gave him one of these hand-bound 28 views of Mount Tamil Pious books, and it turned out he really liked it. And later on, he sent some illustration work my way for some of his poems, and we collaborated on a few broadsides for land preservation things. And by the time I was working on my next really big project, I did a few others, the coast of California and some other things. And I went off and got a doctorate in African history. But in the 1990s, I'd kind of gotten done with a lot of that and moved back to California. And I was thinking of doing a project on the High Sierras. and I asked Gary if he would be willing to give me some writing about the High Sierras that would work in an illustrated book. And he said, well, I have these journals that I've never published, and you're welcome to take some pieces out of them. And I think he thought I was just going to take some little haiku bits out, like in that 28 Views of Mount Tamalpais that had probably a total of 400 words in the whole book. And the journals were so fantastic, and I love to backpack and mountaineer, and I thought he had captured the feeling of backpacking the High Sierras better than anybody I'd ever read. And I loved his poems, and in these journals were the raw material of all his poems of the High Sierras, which are a lot of his best work. And so I ended up printing almost the entire thing, as you'll see when I page through this book, and then it turned into a trade edition book. And out of that came this collaboration with Gary on this latest round of Mount Tamalpais prints, which made this Tamalpais walking book, which actually has in it a lifetime of work. It goes back to some prints that I did when I was in my early teens, all the way up to some of my most recent multicolor prints. And up here on the walls you can see my two most recent Mount Tamalpais prints that didn't even make it into this book, because I finished them after the book had to go to press. But it's two of my sort of eternal subjects that I love so much. One is Mount Tamalpais itself with a moonlit sky, because nighttime looks so good in woodcut. and with a lot of wild lighting that probably is a little too much. And that's the great thing about art. I'm a literalist in my seeing of things, and what I want to render, I want it to look like what I see, because I just am in love with the beauty of the California landscape, and a lot of other landscapes, but especially California. And yet I work in this process that adds all these layers of abstraction to it, so that it comes out taking on a life of its own, and it's far beyond what I literally wanted to render in my very literal-minded artistic way. And so that's what I love so much about printmaking, is the fact that you can take a drawing that really has what you see and turn it into something that has got a magic in it that just takes on its own life. And some of you are printmakers, and you know just what I mean. Every time you do something in printmaking, when you're finished with it, it's not like painting where you could just add another bit of paint and you can change it, and you're seeing just what you get when you paint. No matter what you do, no matter what kind of abstract theory you have about how to distance yourself from your painting, and I know a lot of modern painters have these theories that they sort of discipline themselves with to force them to do something a little different. But the printmaking process just does that all on its own, and it understand, and it does it in a way that takes the art a little bit out of your control. So it's always a surprise at the end. I've been doing this for 40 years, and in the last 15 or 20 years, I've really gotten better and better at the challenges of color printmaking with many, many layers of color. And it still never ends up being exactly what I imagine it being. It becomes what it's going to become. And I'm just sort of facilitating the process. So I thought what I'd do is lead you through the process a little bit, the way I do it with one print. It's this new Bolinas Ridge print that I finished last spring. And it's also the print that was sort of the star of the little 10-minute segment on that PBS show that Carol so nicely invited me to be part of. So if you've seen that, you've actually seen a lot of what I'm going to tell you. But here's the real stuff, and you can come and touch the wood and all the rest. So this is the making of this Bolinas Ridge print. What I start with is a sketch, and I brought a lot of my sketchbooks here. So after I'm done with this formal presentation, you're welcome to look through some of my sketchbooks. I brought some of my most recent sketchbooks, and you can. So I work mostly with this very sophisticated and expensive medium of ballpoint pen. because it's easy to use out there in the dirt and the dust, and it doesn't smear very much when you rub your hand over it. And this is the sketch from which this print came. And you're welcome to page through this book later. And you'll see that I scribble a lot of little details, and then I write a lot of notes about colors and things on here too. And then it sits in my sketchbook. And after a while, I decide maybe I'm going to use it, sometimes just a year later, sometimes 10 years later. And if I'm going to use it, I put some tracing paper over it. And with a very soft pencil, I go over all the lines that I want to become sort of the key lines for the print. And then I take the tracing paper and I turn it over on my first block, which for a lot of these big color prints is a linoleum block that I've made myself from this linseed oil and cork powder mixture of traditional linoleum that comes from Amsterdam, and glued it down onto particle board so it fits in my printing press and it's tie-pie. And then I take the tracing paper down onto the block that's not cut yet and go over the back of all the lines with a ballpoint pen, and I get the whole image transferred onto the block, and then I carve the block with my little Japanese carving tools. And I've gotten more and more of these tools, and the very best ones are these wonderful ones that are made for a lifetime of printmaking. They have a handle that comes apart, and the little blade comes out, and you can, as you sharpen it, it gets shorter, and you can just move the blade up inside, and it'll last a whole lifetime pretty much, or at least 20 years. And this is beautiful Japanese carbon steel, and it's made in that Damascus process in layers that are pounded together like samurai swords, so it's very easy to sharpen. I mean, it takes a very nice sharp edge. And with that, I carve first the key block, and the key block then becomes sort of the template for the rest of the print. So once the key block is done, the key block is printed. This is what the key block image looks like initially for this print. See the difference between the black in the print and what's black on the key block? This shows all the things that I need to transfer onto the other blocks so I can carve them so that they'll all line up together when I go to make the final print. And I print the key block onto Mylar, and while the ink's still wet, I tape it down onto as many other plywood blocks as I'm going to want. And they're all initially, the same size as the key block, so that I have the whole print there. This is what's left of one that I never printed. Then I outline in like red ballpoint pen or something like that the parts that I want to carve away, and I make a whole series of blocks, different color blocks for the different colors I'm going to use in the print.
So that's wood, but you use linoleum first?
The key block was linoleum, okay. and then the color blocks are all wood. And this is a Japanese plywood called Shina plywood. It's kind of linden wood. It's like basswood that we use in the United States for.
Okay, and why do you do that? Why do you do two different medium from linoleum to wood?
The linoleum I like because it for the bigger prints, you can do a lot of fine, very detailed work and a lot of stippling, and it breaks right out. And then I like the plywood from the Shina for the color because it takes the ink so nicely. Yeah. So the Shina is for the color blocks, and then the linoleum is for the key block on all these.
Do you need a block for every different color?
Yeah. Well, I'm getting to that. So then I have all these color blocks made, and I have to make sure I'm going to be able to register them correctly. And I have a printing press that I can lock the blocks into the bed of the press, and I can feed the paper on the feed table with these guides so that I can get absolutely hairline registration. So if the blocks are carved to the image that's been transferred onto them, they should all eventually line up. But to get them to line up, you can't do it just by measuring. You have to have the key block printed on a lot of, oh, by the way, here's my little print press. But you saw it in the PBS video. I imagine most of you saw that because here you are in LA and you watch movies here and you watch TV. I mean, if you're not, you're traitors to your economy, right? And,
Northern California remarks.
yeah, okay. and then I thank you, Carol.
PBS isn't really TV.
No, that's not really TV. Okay. So then I have transferred the key block in another state of it where I've carved away some of the lines, but I left the line around the shadow for some reason. And I make what are called registration proofs. And I make, for a sophisticated print like this, it's going to end up with, this had 14 layers of color in the end. I'm going to make 30 or so of these, because sometimes it takes a while to get it to hit just right. And then I feed them through the press. First I print them all exactly where the image is supposed to be. And they're all fed exactly the same way, hopefully, so that as they go into the press, they're going to be absolutely straight on the paper. So then I put the first color block in, and I try to get it to hit exactly inside the lines of the key block. And that's why these are registration proofs. And once it's hitting right, I switch to the big stack of handmade Japanese paper that I have. And I get this lovely paper now made for me in Japan. Now that I made a lot of prints, I can afford to have really nice paper made. And I start by printing the first color. And here's the first block and the color that came from it. And I'll do the whole edition of prints with the first layer of color on it. And so that's as many as I'm going to do in the edition, because from then on, it's just layer by layer, those same pieces of paper, adding the layers of color. So then I clean the press off, do the whole registration thing the next day, and I restack the paper that I've printed on. I slip sheet it and let it dry, and I add the next layer of color the next day.
Is there a particular type of ink that you use?
I use a lot of different kinds of oil-based inks and mix them together and see what works. So I experiment a lot. And ink, of course, is very transparent, so that I can build up layer upon layer of color. I use a lot of Dan Smith's Miracle Gel Extender in my inks. And lately I've been using a lot of Charbonnel colored etching inks because they have such beautiful pigments. But in the past I've used graphic chemical, and I've used Hanshi stuff that's called lithographic ink, and stuff that's called block printing ink, and all different kinds, and seeing what works, and added different kinds of conditioners to the ink. And what I'm trying to get is a very thin sort of layer of color with these gradated rolls that I can do with the foam rollers in my little hand crank printing press. It's got two rubber rollers that travel with a carriage and a little bike chain to an electric motor that keeps the ink spinning around. And I can add different colors of ink onto the rollers and get these very smooth gradations by controlling the areas in which they mix. And that's a real trick in itself that takes years of practice.
Because there's a lot of transparency in there.
Yeah.
So.
And you know, it tends to get muddy right at the transition point, so you have to constantly be cleaning it out with little bits of paper and wiping it. And then the next layer of color. And then here you're going to see reduction, because all that's left of the yellow block by the time this print was done was this. So in answer to your question of is there a block for every color? No, I do multiple reduction cuts. So I have 6 or 7 starting blocks for the colors, and then on some of the blocks I've done 1, 2, 3 reductions. Some of them I haven't done any.
Do you find you need to do it to get the precision in the wood, or
no? It just speeds it up.
Okay.
I don't have to do a different block for everyone, because my process, at the end, I don't ever want to do it again. You know, it's
So you do a run and
yeah,
then that's it.
the traditional Japanese key block process is that they print one print at a time. And they never numbered editions. They still don't number editions. And so they'll do as many as they can find buyers for, I suppose, or whatever. And for me, I do an edition like in European printmaking.
Right.
And so I start with one layer of color and I build them up. And at the end, I don't want to do it again. And it really helps to have destroyed all the blocks in the process. Because then I can't do it again. So,
Is your final print a reverse of the original drawn image?
no, it's the image. That whole thing with the tracing paper was to reverse the image onto the block,
Got
so it would be
Correct.
forward when I printed it. Yeah. So then, layer by layer, the whole thing builds up like a big flip book, and here you can see the reduction cut in the yellow. There's the first layer of orange on there, and I've added in the poppies, which were on another piece of that same block, and they went with the orange, so I could put them in too. And then the next one, I added in this blue background. And you're looking at the original there, I mean the final print there, so you can keep getting an idea of where it's going.
You said you did this 14 times, so you run it through the press 14 times, correct?
Yeah, each piece of paper goes through 14 times,
right,
so
okay.
times about 200. Because for a final edition of between 165 and 185, I run through about 200 sheets of paper. So that's a lot of cranking. And my right elbow and arm are getting old, you know.
So how many impressions do you get from one coloring? Do you only get one print impression, and then you have to go back and color your blocks again?
I have this wonderful helper, my little printing press that has the foam rollers, you know, that travel with the cylinder. I'm not using an etching press. I'm using something that was made for printing books, and that's where my whole technique comes from. That's why I started talking about the books. The books led me into this printmaking. Now I see myself, I guess, as a printmaker, but I never studied printmaking. I don't know how to use an etching press. I never had anything. I didn't have any formal training in the fine arts, and so the technique I've developed is this hybrid of letterpress, hand cranked letterpress, proofing press. And it's a wonderful machine. And a lot of artists who have studied printmaking come over and see it and they go, oh gosh, this is really great. You know, you can ink it as you print it, you know. You don't have to roll it out on the glass. And I still have, I mix all my inks on a big piece of glass and I roll some little bits out sometimes to fill in little places that need to be filled in, or a little teeny dab of extra color or something. So now the shadow is appearing in there, and some other bits and pieces, some more orange, and then eventually I put the green over that tint block, and this is where the magic of those transparent inks really starts to. So it's like I'm oil painting with underpainting, and then I'm building up the layers. So I have the pink underneath, and then the green comes through over the top, and it changes color, of course, when it goes over the pink, and so you start to have these colors produced. And because the ink's sort of semi-transparent, it gets a little glow going to it. And that's something I just came across by doing this. And now I start to strive for getting these glows to come out in the grass and everything. And so I put 3 or 4 layers now of semi-transparent inks over to get it to really glow. But for me, the fascinating thing is how, as I'm doing it, I had a different idea about what I was going to do with the sea, because the sea never really looks this insanely gold. You know, I mean, it feels like it's like that, though. And I'm trying to get the feeling of being there at sunset, you know. And so it got much more orange and gold than I expected it to get when I was planning the printout. But I realized I really wanted that contrast with the green of the hillside. It was intensely green up there. And so that was something I was trying for. And then the other thing I really liked about the sketch was the big shadow. So the big shadow is a real important part of that print. And it gets almost as dark as the black, but that's just overlays of about 5 or 6 layers of color. in the darkest part of this shadow, because underneath it, it has the orange, it has the green, and then it has several layers of the purple shadow. And then the other thing that I had to learn over many years is that at the end, when you have all your colors, no matter how intense they might look on that white paper, when you put the black ink over them, they really get muted. So you really want to use quite a bit of bright color. And if you look through this book that I did, one of my earlier, my beginning attempts at multi-block printmaking was a book called Walls, that was a travel book, and it was mostly done from what had originally been watercolor sketches, and they were sort of muted in color. And I was just starting to learn how to do the multi-block printmaking, and a lot of things were sort of pastel shades, and I put the ink on the white paper, and it looked pretty bright, so I just left it alone, and at the end the prints looked very subdued. And so I learned that I have to put a little more color in by doing that. Do we have one of those Walls books here? Didn't I bring one that
Yes,
can
you
show
have.
people?
I think it's under there, is it?
No, that's some of the other ones. But anyway, I have that one around. Now, there are some other kinds of blocks that I use. This is from that Walls book. It's a key block in cherry, which was the traditional Japanese wood for making prints with. And the trouble with the cherry blocks for my printing press is that they warp. And that's not good when you have the foam rollers. If you're inking by hand, like in Japan, then it's not a problem at all. So that's why I stopped using those. And I guess I didn't bring the other ones, but I brought that book that you can see. So I now have up here all this sort of show and tell material, and I'm happy to talk about it all and show it to you. But the last thing I want to show you is that this is my most recent print, and I just finished it a week ago. And it's something that turned out to be much more subtle than I had originally intended, because the proof of it, everything was black. This has a reduction cut on the key block. This grayish green part of the city is underneath all this black also, and it was part of the key block that I cut away and then printed the key block again in black. But this has 11, 12 layers of color in it.
So do you always go from lightest to darkest?
Yeah, you have to start with the lightest and then you build up, yeah. So some questions, and then I can show you up here some of the other things. Yeah.
I didn't quite understand when you said you made your own linoleum with pork ash, linseed oil, and something about Amsterdam.
I get this. I have this big roll that's almost gone. I don't know what I'm going to do because I can't find it anymore. It's real linoleum made with boiled linseed oil mixed with cork powder.
Cork powder.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and that's how they used to make battleship linoleum, and they don't make it that way anymore.
Okay.
It's all got plastics in it, and it doesn't take the ink the same way. So I've gone on some hunting expeditions, but virtual ones, and I need to go maybe on a real one
Okay.
to Amsterdam, because that's where it came from. Yeah, but there's German linoleums, but they're just not as good as they used to be. So,
Okay.
yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Artistically, what catches your interest in these prints?
Well, it's the landscape, and of course I like dramatic landscapes with a lot of verticality to them a lot of times, or a lot of sort of intricate forms to trees. What I'm starting on now is a whole Treescapes of California project that's probably going to take 10 years to get enough of them to make a book. There's certain things that seem to lend themselves better to woodcut too, and so things that take a lot of dark detail, forests and big mountainsides, but it's the typical landscape aspects that things like the beautiful curves of glaciated terrain and the really dramatic cliffs of the seacoast, things like that. I mean, California is so full of drama, you know. I mean, we're in this incredibly new and quickly being transformed landscape in geological time, and we've got such an incredible variety of vegetation, you know, on the surface of that geology that it's just a spectacular place to do landscape. That's what attracts me, is the gorgeous landscapes that we have here.
Before you do your sketches, do you draw from memory or do you go out and
Oh no,
scout
it's all from the
photographs?
places, yeah, and
But do you like go to, you know, location, you scout it, you take pictures and then you kind of
no,
set it from there, or-
no.
Or so you just
You're in
go and
film,
sketch?
aren't you? Locations. I go and scout, but I actually do the drawing there, you know, and then I bring it home with me. So like this is a sketchbook of, you know, a lot of, there's a lake hidden down in a bunch of mountains. These are from a recent backpacking trip. This is another view of Mount Tamalpais. I never stopped doing views of Mount Tamalpais. Here's one of Mount Whitney. This will be a print. You can't even tell sometimes how good a print they're going to be, but this is going to be a great print. That's Mount Whitney from Arc Pass. In the foreground is a pass that's about 13,000 feet, and it's not even a pass, it's just a notch between some mountains. And I'm looking out at the wall of Mount Whitney right at dawn, where the eastern face of Whitney's catching all the golden light of dawn. And way down here is the lake that people camp at when they're hiking up there on the trail that goes up there from Whitney Portal.
Now, you make written color notes, but do you
Yeah.
make any kind of, do you just have a color memory?
Yeah, well, you can tell from the colors that I have a sort of a wild imagined color idea, you know. And so then I'm recreating this idea of what it was like when I'm back in the studio, and I'm developing it over many, many weeks of printing. So the fun parts of printmaking are in order, being out there sketching, especially on backpacking trips, you know. And then second, picking out the one I want to work on and the whole creative idea of conceptualizing how it's going to become a print. Then carving the key block. That's sort of fun. I really enjoy carving. I've spent a whole lifetime learning how to carve well. And I did an apprenticeship with myself as a child, you know, a teenager. I first learned how to do black and white and do texture and line and negative positive stuff, which you got to learn first. And I didn't try to use color, multiple colors, until I had already gotten very good at doing all that, and also I'd gotten fast at carving, because you don't really want to try to do a 14-color block until you can carve pretty quickly and pretty accurately. And so I waited 15 or 20 years before I started doing that. And then I picked up on how the traditional Japanese key block technique had been done, and adapted it to this oil-based letterpress printing way of doing things that I'd gotten from the book arts. And that's how I finally came into where I'm at now.
What kind of margin for error do you have carving the block? It looks pretty unforgiving.
Yeah, well, you actually, I don't make very many mistakes carving blocks like this. I mean, there's no mistakes in there, but every once in a while, if you have some little problem, like this is from quite a few years ago, her arm got a little too much white on it, so I filled it in with some wood putty. Yeah, wood filler.
That's the kind of thing I'm interested in.
Yeah. If you screw up, you use a little wood filler, or if it's a big screw up and you got the piece, you can glue it back in.
Okay.
You know, if things are really desperate, you can cut a little piece out, fit it in. You know, I mean, if you can do inlays and things like that, which is what this is sort of tantamount to in woodworking, you can do anything eventually to save it.
I remember looking at a Winslow Homer watercolor, and there's all these little tricks and patches and things. I thought, oh, come on, okay.
Yeah. There's always, you know, that's part of it. You got to save it. Once you've invested enough time and energy and it's turning out good, if something bad happens, you have to be able to save it. But rarely does that happen for me. In fact, I can't think of any print I've done in the last 10 years that I've had a major screw up in terms of the materials.
Yeah.
Just in terms of, conceptualizing. And I've also learned to print always at least one extra one of those blocks with the image, the key block image transferred onto it, because I always want to throw in another color or two. Here's one that really got out of control up there. That one, it's the left side of a big diptych of San Francisco Bay at sunset from the hills behind Berkeley. And that ended up having 17 layers of color on it, just that print there. All these reduction cuts, and that was all planned, but then the city just didn't quite move out in front of the fog enough, and a whole nother layer just to get the city to move out, and another layer just to get the bridge to move out in front of the city, just a little bit, and very subtly. And the trouble is all my prints are done at this focal distance, and that's kind of where I'm thinking, I'm still a book artist, really. And I'm thinking that you're having an intimate, sort of viewing of this thing, like in a book. And it's not really ever intended to be wall art. Yeah, and this might be one of the first ones that I did where I saw where it was going and it was simple enough. I said, I'm just going to leave it and let it be more something you see from far away. But it turns out there's so much detail and everything in here that the last hurrah that the images get after I've sold out the editions and everything is a few of the best ones, or the ones people like the best. And people have told me that they still want and they can't get anymore. I've blown them up with that giclée process into great big digital prints. And then you can see all the detail, and it really actually works pretty well on some of them. It really draws you into the landscape, and I can't do anything big. The biggest things I do are this big. That's the bed of my printing press. And that's how far your arm can reach over when you're carving. And I use only these small Japanese tools, and so bigger gouges for clearing, but generally these small tools. So I just make things at this one sort of size, Okay.
Do you do your sketching all in one sitting, or do you have to go back at the same time of day and try to catch it?
I generally do it in one, but if it's something that's relatively recent and it's a real project that I'm thinking I'm going to do, like this Grizzly Peak diptych, I went back a couple times there. Once I decided I was going to do it. And there's another big diptych I did from Bolinas Ridge, looking out of the Pacific, and I went back there a few times because there were some things I was missing once I decided to do it. But if it's 5 days up in the high Sierras in the middle of winter, how am I going to go back there at that time to do that? I never will. So
A good sleeping bag.
yeah, right.
Do you teach, or do you have people apprentice with you so that
I've had
your techniques are not lost?
Oh, yeah, right.
Because there's a lot of stuff lost in Japanese art.
Yeah. Oh, really? Is there? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it gets rediscovered.
Well, people, yeah. Well, I think it's better for people to rediscover it and just reinvent it for themselves. That's what I did. I mean, yeah, I've taught people. I taught a class that really produced some fun stuff about 4 or 5 years in a row at the San Francisco Center for the Book, where they have 3 printing presses just like mine. So I taught a class where people could make a 3-color print, and I got them to do their key block, and I sent them home, and they came back to the key block, and we transferred it a week later, and then they carved their color blocks, and then we all came back and spent a couple hours on each person's print with 3 presses with a different color on each one. And gosh, with a little manipulation and some bokashi effects, these sort of fades in the sky and everything, we could take almost anything and make it look really great. But that's the joy of printmaking. All of you that have ever experimented with relief printmaking know that you do a little linoleum cut or a wood cut, and it just takes on this magic. Once you put the ink on it and you print it, it's always great, no matter what it is. And then the process just goes on from there as you acquire some control. Sue?
Yeah, I'm sorry if this is ignorant of artists. What is a reduction cut?
Well, that's where you print it. You print the same block in one color,
right.
Then you cut it away some more and print it again. So you've reduced the block. And for me, it's just a way of speeding up the multi-block printmaking process. But there's people that do what are called suicide reduction cuts. There's a guy up in Carmel, Gordon Mortensen, that does the most amazing things. I don't know. you know, it's bad enough to have to think double backwards and all the stuff I do with the registration, but he is really painting negatively. And it's like painting the way he does it. He puts down a layer of color, which is like his tint from a big block, with a couple of things cut out that he wants white in the print. And then that's going to be behind everything. And then he cuts away the block and prints it again. And what he's really thinking about is the things he cuts away are coming through with that color. But then he also has to be thinking that those two are making another color that he's going to then cut away again, and that color will come through. But those two are going to make another, those three are now going to make another color, and he's had to plan that all somehow ahead. He's got 14, 15, 20 layer suicide reduction cuts.
So the block is disappearing and changing as you go.
Yeah, but it's the color that's coming through that really counts.
Do a whole bunch of it, huh?
Yeah, and you have to use thin inks because you can't. Now the people that are less sophisticated use really opaque inks, and you see that with a lot of woodblock printmaking. But it doesn't get that beautiful glow that you can get from the semi-transparent inks.
Or the really dark black. I mean, that's.
Well, yeah, then you throw the
at the
really
very
dark
end,
black at the end.
To get that really solid black,
Yeah.
which is key
Yeah,
to
and-
making the contrast.
Yeah, and if you put a lot of kind of thick opaque inks over each other, then you can't get that either. Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, many, and this is my own idiosyncratic hybrid version, letterpress derived. You know, I'm book printing. You know.
You ever illustrate a book or ask to illustrate a book?
Yeah, I tried that with my friend and teaching and printing mentor William Everson, who taught the poet who taught for a while at UC Santa Cruz, and I was never too happy with most of my attempts at illustration. I do best just doing my own creative thing, but people have picked them up and used them for all kinds of things, you know, because once I've done it, then it might fit in for, so people have used them for book cover jackets and illustrations and things, yeah. The ones that are already made.